We're going to move now to begin panel 3, other data inputs into the DGAs. Food pattern modeling for dietary guidelines will be spoken by Patricia Britten from USDA, former USDA. I want to emphasize once again, we're going to have questions at the end of the panel, not after each speaker. Thank you.
Hello, and it's good to see some folks that I know from near or far, and also to meet some new folks on this panel. I was asked to speak about the use of food pattern modeling for the dietary guidelines, and that's very specific. When I talk about food pattern modeling, I'm going to use that term as we use it to support the dietary guidelines. And is this what I use right here? Yep. Okay. The dietary guidelines since 1980 have all included recommendations for either amounts of food groups to eat or have recommended food guides or food patterns that are all based on what have been the USDA dietary or food patterns over time. So this is not something that is new. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the dietary guidelines. Of course, the USDA food patterns go back far beyond the dietary guidelines. They actually began under many different names 100 years ago. So we have a long history, have had a long history at USDA of having food guidance based in terms of talking about amounts of various food groups to eat. The food groups have changed, the amounts have changed, the concerns have changed, and what I'm showing you here are pictures. And a lot of people get confused and take the picture or the icon and assume that that is the food pattern. And I just want to point out that we use a picture to represent a food pattern, to give maybe a hint about what it is, but all of these over time have had quantified food patterns, amounts of food to eat for various groups or various calorie levels over time that underlie this. And so at some point the picture could change and the underlying food patterns could be the same, or vice versa. You could have changes in the food patterns, updates in them, or revisions without changing the picture. So just remember that they are not identical. And so that's why I'm talking about USDA food patterns. I'm not talking about the name for the most current picture that represents it. So what are the USDA food patterns then? Some of you are well aware of what they are in detail, and some probably are less so. They are basically recommendations for what, in terms of food groups, and how much to eat and drink to meet dietary guidelines and DRI recommendations. So they are based on both conclusions from the dietary guidelines and recommended amounts of nutrients from the DRIs. They are based on the range of typical American food choices. And I think that that's important, and that's a distinction between the USDA food patterns and some other food patterns that are recommended. They are the typical food choices, but in nutrient-dense forms, and that's vital. We are not talking about something that has extra calories added in the forms of sugar and fat. We're talking about the basic nutrient-dense form of food. They are not based on sample menus. Some other food patterns are based on amounts of specific foods that have been fed or that have been observed to be eaten, and it's really based on those foods and those foods only. We are very broad in looking at all the foods, all the types of foods that are eaten. And the current patterns have evolved over time from seminal work that started in the early 1980s on a total diet guidance. Before that, the emphasis was on adequacy. To meet nutrient deficiency or to resolve nutrient deficiencies. This is based on looking at both goals for adequacy, but also limits for moderation. So that has been true since the early 1980s. For those of you that may be less familiar, I know you can't read these numbers, but what do the USDA food patterns look like? This is the Healthy US style pattern currently that's in the 2015 dietary guidelines. It has down the left-hand side the food groups. These are the way that food is split into various groups and subgroups currently. And of course, that also can change. And then across the top are 12 calorie levels from 1,000 up to 3,200 calories. These calorie levels are used to define how much food from each of those food groups should be eaten at that calorie level. And that calorie level is there to represent the energy needs of specific segments of the population. And those are all specified so that, you know, a 2-year-old would be at the 1,000 level, calorie level, and would have these amounts from each food group. A active teenage boy would be 3,200 calories or up, and they would be listed in the last column, the amounts they would need. Now, each of these calorie levels are tested against the nutrient recommendations for that age group. So we do not test, for example, a preschooler's nutrient needs or a preschooler's pattern, let's say, maybe 1,200 or 1,400, against the nutrient needs that might be for an adult woman or a teenage boy. We test them specifically for the age groups to which they would apply. So that's what the patterns actually look like. So now, what is food pattern modeling? Food pattern modeling is using these food patterns and making some kind of a change in them, a modification to them, and then assessing the impacts on the nutrient goals for the pattern. So, and those are nutrient goals. How do the patterns change in meeting their nutrient goals if you make some kind of a modification to them? And this is a way to answer hypothetical questions that could be result of questions from dietary guidelines, committee members, or others in their food-based recommendations. And I'll have some examples later on. Food pattern modeling, as we use it for the dietary guidelines, is not dietary pattern optimization. It is not menu modeling, and it is not the process by which these patterns are initially developed. This is a very short history of food pattern modeling because food pattern modeling has a very short history. It started in 2005. In 2005, and Dr. Lipton, you remember, don't you? Yes. Committee members asked some questions when we presented the potential changes at that point in the USDA food patterns to the committee. What if, I called them what if questions. Before there was food pattern modeling, I termed these things what if. And they wanted to know what if, and because Dr. Lupton is on the panel, but I didn't realize it when I came up with this example, what if a person ate the amount of whole grains that at that time was recommended, but did not eat the refined grains that would make up the other half of the grain recommendation? In other words, we had a recommendation for a certain amount of grains. Half of those should be whole grains, because of the science on whole grains and health. The rest could be refined grains. But what happens if the person didn't eat those and just ate the 3 ounces? Would there be an impact? And so that was a what if question, totally hypothetical. So we did a modeling exercise to see what would happen. And this process was developed, a number of questions, and we came up with a way of, with the committee, coming up with a proposed method to make changes and then write up a report of what the impacts would be. Now that was 2005, and many of those, actually all of the modeling exercises we did became an appendix to the committee report. In 2010, the committee members came in to the process with expectations that, oh, you know, we can do this modeling, but they really had little idea about what it was still at that point. And so we actually had a workshop for some of the committee members and went through what it was, how the patterns were developed, how we could do this, how we could answer some of these questions, and then, you know, kind of generate a few questions just to start the process. By 2015, the committee came in with a very different sense. You know, this was now an established method. It was part of what they were expecting to do as part of the dietary guidelines. And they already had, we had things in the literature now that really discussed the process and the results. And so it really became established by 2015. I just wanted to put this quote in because I think it's important to understand why this is an important component of the dietary guidelines process. And that is that, and Dr. Garza was talking about the reductionist research, the majority of research at this point in time, and this was 2006, examines the effect of specific nutrients, food components, or individual food groups. And that food pattern modeling allowed the DGAC to assess the impact of converting a full set of nutrient recommendations based on that body of research into food-based recommendations, so that there was a gap that could be filled. Now, the notion that dietary patterns research is lacking. There's been a lot of dietary pattern research since 2006. It's really exploded. However, there are certain components of it, especially the quantitative components of it, that still are lacking, and so food pattern modeling does still fill a gap. Okay, it's a very simple process that we do. Subcommittees of the Dietary Guidelines Committee pose potential modeling questions. We discuss the planned approach. We modify the appropriate food pattern elements, and I'm going to talk about what the elements are in a sec. Calculate the hypothetical nutritional outcomes, provide a report to the DGAC, and then the committee can use that report and the conclusions of that report to draft their conclusions or to inform their recommendations. Very often they use it to support a recommendation that they feel is important from the literature, but they want to make sure there's no unintended consequences. Elements of the food patterns that can be modified. We have amounts, and I showed you on the other slide, amounts from each food group. We have the inclusion or exclusion of certain foods, such as in a vegetarian pattern. We have goals and constraints. These are largely from the DRI, but they can be modified. We have food group nutrient profiles. Food group nutrient profiles are the expected amount of a nutrient that you would receive if you ate as the typical as the population eats this food group, let's say fruits. Over time, you eat a large variety of fruits across the population, and you eat them all in nutrient-dense forms. What nutrients would you expect to receive from that? And so that's what a nutrient profile is. And so I'm going to give one example of food pattern modeling, and it's going to relate to this, and it's going to be our typical choices analysis. This question, this was in 2010. What is the impact on caloric and nutrient intake if the USDA food patterns are followed, but typical rather than nutrient-dense choices are made? Okay, instead of drinking fat-free milk, you drink 2% milk, or full-fat cheese instead of low-fat cheese, or microwave popcorn with butter instead of air-pop popcorn. So if all of your choices were typical, in other words, the most common choice across the population, we had to modify our nutrient profiles because nutrient profiles are based on nutrient-dense choices. So we went back and looked at food consumption based on NHANES and looked at the most typical form of each food that's in those nutrient profiles. Ran the analysis and identified the impacts on calorie and nutrient intake. This is from a J&D article in 2012 that I have the citation for. And this is the results. If you can see, if typical choices are consumed, the bottom is our nutrient-dense choices, the bottom bar. The same food group at the top, if typical choices are made. Many more calories. The lighter shaded parts of each food group there are the extra calories if people eat foods as they typically do. So this is based on the amounts in a 2,000 calorie pattern. And if you notice, the bottom bar has room at the end for what we call SOFAs then, and that's solid fats and added sugar calories. And it had room for 258 calories. The top bar did not have any room for those. They're already in the foods, but it was way more than the pattern needed, so that you would be consuming, if you ate the recommended amounts, but in typical forms, over 2,300 calories. So the DGAC came up with a recommendation that said the typical choices result in a diet that is too high in calories, total fat, saturated fat, sodium, and cholesterol, and the pattern should include only nutrient-dense foods with small allowances for solid fats and added sugars. And this, of course, just gave further justification to their recommendations that choices be in nutrient-dense forms. A couple key assumptions are that this assumes a population-based consumption pattern. It's not appropriate for any one individual, and it does look at what are the range of foods and the proportions of food typically consumed by Americans. It also assumes that there's compliance with all the food intake recommendations, not just the one that we're looking at in that particular modeling. Some of the challenges are that by nature, it's hypothetical, and we cannot predict what people will actually do with this recommendation, but it does give us a model for it, as with a weather report doesn't tell you for sure it's going to rain, but it suggests that it's probably going to rain. It cannot predict health outcomes. We have other types of evidence for that. And it relies on our existing databases for food consumption and composition. So if there's a novel food that comes in that we don't have good data on yet, it doesn't include that. But it can be used to identify potential unintended consequences of a recommendation. And I think that's probably its greatest value. Now, I know my 15 is up, but I was asked to speak also about data analyses very briefly, and these are the types of evidence that are used in developing the dietary guidelines. So the last one is data analyses, and this has actually grown over time in terms of how many data analyses are used by the committee, and it was used widely in 2015. Data analysis is simply using existing data sources, usually NHANES, it's widely used, other data from CDC is widely used, to provide a current snapshot of diet and health issues. And these are questions, again, posed by the DGAC that want to know, where do we stand on this, and what does it look like? And so we are not doing any modeling, we are not doing any analysis, we're not doing any literature review. We're simply giving this snapshot of where we stand, or else what's the trend over time. These are examples of what data analyses are. What food groups do people consume, and how much do they consume of the food groups that are in the food patterns? A health-related one, what's the current prevalence of overweight obesity in the U.S. population? And they ask questions about trends in that as well. And then looking at food sources to see where some of the issues are in terms of overconsumption. What are the top foods contributing to sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars intake by the U.S. population? And that's all I'm going to say about data analysis. I have these are the sources where you can learn more about food pattern modeling. There's an article in Journal of Nutrition Education and Behavior from 2006. The General Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics article I mentioned in 2012, and then the 3 DGAC reports where food pattern modeling. All of the modeling analyses are there either in the hardcover report or in the online version, so you can see the full reports. And that's it.
Thank you.